In the spring of 1979, the streets of Soho, Manhattan, did not hum with the polished luxury of high-end boutiques or the hushed prestige of world-class art galleries that define the neighborhood today. Back then, it was a place of iron and grit, a labyrinth of cast-iron facades and cobblestones where the echoes of New York's industrial past still lingered in the air. It was a community in transition, a sanctuary for artists and young families who sought a village-like intimacy amidst the towering indifference of the great city. Neighbors recognized each other's faces, shopkeepers knew the names of the local children, and there was a pervasive, perhaps naive, belief that within these few blocks, one was safe. It was against this backdrop of urban innocence that a 6-year-old boy named Ethan Patz prepared to take a step that would, in his eyes, signal his entry into the world of the big kids. Ethan was a child of vibrant spirit, known for his mop of sandy hair and a smile that seemed to light up the dimly lit lofts of Prince Street. To his parents, Stan and Julie Patz, he was the heartbeat of their home, a boy whose curiosity was as boundless as the city streets he longed to explore. For weeks, Ethan had been pleading for a new responsibility, a simple rite of passage that most children in the neighborhood eventually earned: the right to walk to the school bus stop alone. It was a journey of a mere 2 blocks, a short stretch of sidewalk that felt like a vast frontier to a small boy. On the morning of May 25, 1979, Julie Patz finally looked into her son's eager eyes and said the word he had been waiting for: yes. The morning air carried the faint scent of rain and the distant rumble of early traffic as Ethan dressed for his big day. He donned a blue parka, corduroy pants, and sneakers, clutching a small blue cloth bag that held his treasures. In his pocket, he carried a $1 bill, a gift from his mother to buy a soda at the local bodega before the bus arrived. Julie stood at the doorway of their loft, watching as her son stepped out into the hallway. There was no grand farewell, no sense of impending shadow, just the mundane, beautiful routine of a Friday morning. She watched him descend the stairs, her heart likely fluttering with that universal parental mixture of pride and protective anxiety. She saw him reach the street, a small figure framed by the massive architecture of Soho, and then, with a final wave, he turned the corner and walked out of her sight. In those first few minutes, the world remained unchanged. The bodega owner prepared for the morning rush, the bus driver made his rounds, and the city continued its relentless pace. But somewhere in those 2 short blocks, in the brief span of time it takes for a child's legs to cover a few hundred yards, the trajectory of American childhood was irrevocably altered. Ethan reached the corner of Prince and West Broadway, heading toward the stop where the yellow bus would whisk him away to school. He was a boy with $1 in his pocket and a sense of freedom in his chest. But the bus arrived, the doors folded open, and the driver waited. Other children climbed aboard, their laughter filling the cabin, but the seat Ethan usually occupied remained empty. The first failure of the day was one of silence. At Eton School, his teacher noted his absence, but in an era before automated alerts and instant connectivity, no one called the Patz household to check on the boy. It was assumed he was simply homesick or that his parents had kept him back for the long Memorial Day weekend. Back at the loft, Julie Patz went about her day, her mind occupied with 1,000 small tasks of motherhood, comforted by the belief that her son was safe within the walls of his classroom. The hours ticked by with a cruel normalcy. The sun climbed high over Manhattan, casting long shadows through the narrow streets, while the person who had intercepted Ethan was already beginning it. It wasn't until the mid-afternoon, when the school bus returned and the neighborhood children began to spill back onto the sidewalks, that the silence was finally broken. Julie waited at the meeting point, her eyes scanning the cluster of small bodies for the blue parka and the sandy hair. One child stepped off, then another, until the bus driver finally pulled the doors shut and moved on. Etan was not there. The initial spark of confusion quickly fanned into a cold, paralyzing dread. Julie began to ask the other children, her voice rising in pitch, her heart hammering against her ribs. Had they seen him? Had he been at school? The answers were a chorus of no. By the time Stan Patz returned home, the neighborhood was already beginning to stir with a frantic energy. The police were called, but in 1979, the protocol for a missing child was vastly different from the urgent, high-tech response of today. In those early hours, there was a lingering hope among the responding officers that the boy had simply wandered off, perhaps lured by a stray cat or a construction site, and would be found hiding in a basement or playing in a park. But as the sun began to set over the Hudson River, plunging Soho into a deep, unsettling darkness, the realization began to settle in. Etan hadn't just wandered off, he had vanished. The Patz Loft, once a place of artistic creation and family warmth, became a command center of desperation. Friends, neighbors, and strangers gathered, clutching flashlights and printed flyers. They fanned out across the city, peering into dark alleys, shouting Eaton's name into the industrial voids of empty warehouses, and knocking on doors that remained stubbornly closed. The image of Eaton's face, captured in a photograph taken by his father, a professional photographer, began to appear on lampposts and storefront windows. It was a hauntingly beautiful image, a boy frozen in a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. It was this image that would soon become the face of a national crisis. As the first night bled into the second day, the investigation took on a feverish intensity. The NYPD launched one of the largest searches in the city's history. Scuba divers braved the murky, dangerous waters of the city's sewers. Helicopters buzzed over the rooftops, and bloodhounds were brought in to sniff the cobblestones where Etan had last been seen. Every trash can was overturned, every rooftop searched, and every resident of the surrounding blocks was questioned. Yet, Manhattan seemed to have swallowed the boy whole. There were no witnesses who had seen a struggle, no discarded items, no breadcrumbs left behind. Just the echoing silence of a street that had failed to protect one of its own. The cultural impact of Eaton's disappearance was immediate and profound. Up until that point, American parents had lived with a sense of communal trust. Children were the pulse of the neighborhood, allowed to roam with a freedom that is almost unrecognizable today. But as the news of Etan Patz spread across the airwaves, a collective shiver ran through the nation's households. The stranger danger era was born in the shadow of the Soho lofts. The fear wasn't just that a child could be lost. It was the terrifying realization that a child could be taken in broad daylight, just steps from their front door, while the world looked the other way. For Stan and Julie, the pain was a physical weight, a suffocating presence that filled every room of their home. They refused to change their phone number, terrified that Etan might try to call and find a busy signal. They refused to move, clinging to the hope that their son would one day remember the way back to Prince Street and ultimate nightmare, the not knowing. The lack of a body, the lack of a motive, and the lack of a suspect created a void that no amount of police work could fill. In those early weeks, the investigation felt like a race against time, but as the days turned into months, the urgency began to give way to a grim, plodding persistence. The detectives assigned to the case were haunted by the boys' eyes, seeing their own children in the flyers that were now beginning to fade and peel under the New York sun. The case was no longer just a file. It was a wound in the heart of the city. And as the one-year anniversary approached with no new leads, the search for Etan Patz began to transform from a local tragedy into a catalyst for a revolution in how America protected its most vulnerable. The boy who went to buy a soda had become a symbol, but to the two people sitting in a quiet loft in Soho, he was still just their son, and the door was still unlocked, waiting for a footfall that never came. The The silence that settled over Prince Street in the wake of Etton's disappearance was not merely the absence of sound. It was a heavy, suffocating presence that seemed to alter the very chemistry of the neighborhood. As the days bled into weeks, the initial frantic energy of the search evolved into a grim, rhythmic desperation. For Stan and Julie Patz, the world had shrunk to the dimensions of their loft in the 2-block radius where their son had last been seen. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant siren, and every shadow cast by the passing streetlights became a potential signal, a cruel trick of hope played by a mind pushed to the brink of endurance. They were trapped in a temporal loop, forever waking up to the morning of May 25th, only to realize by sunset that the void remained unfilled. As the traditional leads began to dry up, the investigation underwent a transformation that would eventually ripple across the entire continent. The Patz family, supported by a community of artists who understood the power of the visual image, refused to let Etton's face fade from the public consciousness. In an era before the internet provided a digital bulletin board for the lost, they turned to the most mundane of household objects, the milk carton. It started as a grassroots effort, a way to put Etton's sandy hair and infectious grin into the hands of every parent sitting at a breakfast table. It was a haunting juxtaposition, the ultimate symbol of domestic safety and nourishment, carrying the image of a child who had been snatched from the heart of it. Etan became the first milk carton kid, a pioneer in a gallery of the missing that would soon haunt the kitchens of America. This shift marked the beginning of a profound cultural sea change. Before Etan, the concept of a child being abducted by a stranger was a statistical rarity, a ghost story whispered to keep children from wandering too far. But as Etton's face stared back from grocery store shelves in every state, the stranger danger era was officially inaugurated. The American psyche, already bruised by the social upheavals of the 1970s, retreated into a defensive posture. The communal trust that had allowed children to navigate their neighborhoods with autonomy was replaced by a new, rigid vigilance. Playgrounds became fortresses, and the walk to the bus stop, once a simple rite of passage, was now viewed as a gauntlet of potential horrors. The political machinery in Washington began to stir, propelled by the sheer, unyielding grief of the Patz family. Their tragedy became the catalyst for a national infrastructure of protection. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan officially designated May 25th as National Missing Children's Day, a move that gave a date to the collective anxiety of the nation. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was the spark for the creation of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. First time, law enforcement agencies began to bridge the jurisdictional gaps that had allowed predators to slip through the cracks. The Etan Patz effect was real, tangible, and life-saving for thousands of other children, yet for Stan and Julie, these milestones were bittersweet reminders of the high price paid for such progress. They had become the architects of a safer world, built on the foundation of their own shattered lives. Behind the scenes, the NYPD's Missing Person Squad continued to grind through a mountain of tips that led everywhere and nowhere. They looked into the chicken hawks, the predatory men who frequented the darker corners of the city's transit hubs. They followed leads to remote communes and overseas sightings, each one a flicker of light that inevitably extinguished upon closer inspection. The basement of the bodega on the corner of Prince and West Broadway was searched, but the forensic tools of 1979 were blunt instruments compared to the precision of the future. There were no bloodstains revealed by luminol, no DNA profiles to be extracted from the dust. The physical evidence was non-existent, leaving the detectives to rely on the shifting sands of human memory and the hope that someone, somewhere, would finally feel the weight of a guilty conscience. Stan Patz, a man who viewed the world through the lens of a camera, continued to document their journey. He took photographs of the flyers as they weathered and tore, of the empty bedroom that remained a shrine to a 6-year-old's interests, and of Julie, whose face became a map of a decade's worth of sorrow. They made a pact that felt like a holy vow. They would never move. They believed that if Atan were ever to escape his captors or find his way out of the fog of amnesia, he must be able to return to the exact coordinates from which he vanished. They kept the same phone number, paying the bill every month as if it were a tether to their son's voice. In the quiet hours of the night, the phone would occasionally ring, a wrong number, a telemarketer, or a cruel prankster, and for a split second, the air in the loft would crackle with the impossible possibility that it was him. As the 1980s drew to a close, the case began to settle into the cold, hard reality of a cold case. The initial investigators retired, passing the thick binders of reports to a new generation of detectives who looked at Eaton's photo with a mixture of reverence and frustration. The neighborhood of Soho was changing. The grit was being polished away by gentrification, and the old industrial lofts were being converted into luxury condos. The cobblestones where Atan had walked were now traversed by tourists who had no memory of the boy on the milk carton. But for those who had been there, the corner of Prince and West Broadway remained a haunted intersection. It was a place where the American dream of safety had been interrogated and found wanting, and where a family's love had transformed into a monumental decades-long vigil that refused to accept the finality of silence. The search for Atan Patz, once a sprint, had slowed into a grueling marathon of decades. As the initial hysteria of 1979 cooled, the investigation entered a more cynical phase, characterized by the realization that the monster who took Atan might not have been a shadow in a doorway, but a man with a name, a history, and a face. For the detectives who inherited the case, the trail led away from the bustling sidewalks of Soho and into the dark, damp corners of the city's criminal underbelly. It was here that the name José Ramos first began to circulate, a name that would become synonymous with the investigation's most frustrating and prolonged dead end. José Ramos was not a stranger to the machinery of the Patz case. Was a single, haunting connection. He had been an associate of the woman who was briefly hired as Eaton's babysitter. This proximity was more than a coincidence. It was a jagged piece of a puzzle that the NYPD desperately tried to force into place. In the mid-1980s, the investigation narrowed its sights on Ramos with a singular intensity. They didn't just want him for his past crimes. They wanted him to be the answer to the question that was still written on every faded flyer in Manhattan. In 1982, the FBI and local police conducted a massive search of a drainage pipe in Lower Manhattan after receiving a tip that Ramos had been seen there. It was a scene of grim determination, men in hazmat suits crawling through the filth of the city's veins, searching for a bone, a piece of fabric, a blue cloth bag. They found nothing, but the lack of physical evidence did little to deter the suspicion. To the authorities, Ramos looked like the killer, acted like the killer, and possessed the dark impulses of the killer. The problem, however, was the bedrock of the American legal system, the need for proof. The psychological warfare between the state and Ramos was a slow-burn drama. In interrogation rooms, Ramos was a master of the maybe. He spoke in riddles, occasionally hinting that he had been in Soho that day, that he had seen a boy who looked like Atan, only to retract his statements with a smirk. He played with the detectives' desperation, feeding them just enough hope to keep the investigation focused on him, perhaps enjoying the macabre celebrity that came with being the prime suspect in the nation's most famous missing persons case. For Stan and Julie Patz, this was a special kind of torture. They were forced to watch a man who represented their worst nightmares dance on the edge of a confession for 20 years, never falling in and never walking away. By 2001, the frustration had reached a breaking point. Without enough evidence to bring criminal charges, the Patz family, supported by attorney Brian O'Dwyer, took a radical step. They sued Jose Ramos in civil court for the wrongful death of their son. It was a move born of a desire for some semblance of accountability, even if it couldn't put a man behind bars. In a move that shocked the legal community, a judge ruled in favor of the Patz family. Jose Ramos was legally declared responsible for the death of Etienne Patz. It was a victory, yes, but a hollow one. Ramos was already in prison for other crimes, and the ruling didn't bring Etienne home. It was a piece of paper that confirmed what many already believed, yet the silence from the ground remained absolute. The Ramos era of the investigation was defined by a specific type of urban folklore. Every time a new construction project broke ground in Soho, or a landlord renovated an old basement, the whispers would start again. Is Etienne under the concrete? Is he behind that false wall? The neighborhood had become a graveyard of theories. The once vibrant artist lofts were now worth millions, but beneath the high-end finishes and the minimalist decor, the memory of the boy in the blue parka remained embedded in the foundation. People who moved into the area years later would find themselves looking at the corner of Prince and West Broadway, feeling a phantom chill, aware that they were walking on ground that held a secret the city refused to yield. As the decades turned, the technology of investigation underwent a metamorphosis. The blunt tools of the 70s were replaced by the surgical precision of the 21st century. In 2012, more than 30 years after Etienne vanished, the FBI returned to Soho. They didn't come for Jose Ramos this time. They came for a basement on Prince Street, just a few doors down from the Patz home. A handyman had once worked, and ground-penetrating radar agents spent days tearing up the concrete floor. The world watched on live television, a collective breath held as the dust settled. Once again, the earth gave up nothing. The basement was empty. This failed search felt like a final blow to the community's hope. If the most advanced technology couldn't find a trace of him within sight of his own front door, then where was he? The Ramos theory began to lose its gravity, leaving the investigators with a terrifying realization. They might have been looking at the wrong monster for 30 years. The case was a labyrinth where every path eventually hit a wall. But just as the world was beginning to accept that the Etienne Patz case would remain a permanent mystery, a phone call from a small town in New Jersey changed everything. A man named Pedro Hernandez was living a quiet, unremarkable life. He was a religious man, a family man, a man who attended church and worked menial jobs. But he carried a weight that had begun to crush him. He had told people, his ex-wife, his sister, members of his prayer group, that he had done something terrible in New York City a long time ago. He told them he had killed a child. For years, these people had kept his secret, perhaps dismissing it as the ramblings of a troubled soul or the delusions of a man with a fragile mind. But in 2012, as the news of the basement search in Soho dominated the headlines, the silence finally broke. The tip that led to Pedro Hernandez didn't come from a forensic lab or a high-tech satellite. It came from the oldest source in the history of crime, a guilty conscience and a family's inability to carry a secret any longer. When detectives first approached Hernandez, they didn't find a defiant predator like Jose Ramos. They found a man who seemed almost relieved to be caught. As he sat in a sterile room, his voice a low murmur, he began to recount a story that was so simple, so mundane, and so horrific that it felt like a cold blade to the heart of the investigation. He spoke of the bodega. He spoke of a 1.400-word confession that would eventually form the basis of a legal battle unlike any other in New York history. He described the morning of May 25th not from the perspective of a hunter, but as a worker who saw an opportunity. He talked about the dollar in Eaton's hand, the promise of a soda, and the dark stairs leading down into the basement of the store. As he spoke, the map of the investigation shifted. Jose Ramos faded into the background, replaced by a new face, a face that had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, selling candy and soda to the children of Prince Street. For Stan and Julie, the emergence of Hernandez was a new chapter of pain. They had spent decades hating Ramos, building a version of the truth around him, only to be told that the killer might have been even closer than they imagined. The man who potentially ended their son's life wasn't a drifter or a career criminal. He was the boy behind the counter. The investigation was no longer about searching the woods or the sewers. It was about the reliability of a man's mind and the weight of a confession without a body to back it up. The stage was being set for a confrontation in a New York courtroom that would interrogate the very nature of truth, memory, and the limits of justice. The emergence of Pedro Hernandez in 2012 was not the explosive climax the public had expected after 33 years of silence. Rather, it was a quiet, unsettling unraveling of a secret that had been hidden in plain sight. When the detectives from the NYPD's Cold Case Squad sat across from Hernandez in a sterile interrogation room, they didn't find a defiant predator like Jose Ramos. They found a man who seemed diminished, a man whose shoulders were slumped under the weight of a rhythmic murmur, recounting a sequence of events so mundane in their beginning and so horrific in their end, that they seemed to defy the very logic of the sun-drenched morning of 1979. He spoke of the bodega at the corner of Prince and West Broadway, a place where he had been just another face behind the counter, a teenager stockboy who blended into the industrial tapestry of Soho. He described seeing Etan, a small, vibrant boy with a dollar bill clutched in his hand. Hernandez confessed that he had lured the child into the darkness of the basement with the simple, age-old promise of a soda. In that damp, subterranean space, amidst the crates of glass bottles and the smell of stale cardboard, Hernandez claimed he had wrapped his hands around the boy's neck. He described the struggle not as an act of calculated malice, but as a sudden, inexplicable impulse that left him standing over a limp body in the shadows. The most chilling segment of the confession was the disposal. Hernandez told investigators that he had placed Etan, who he believed might still have been alive and gasping, into a plastic bag, tucked him inside a cardboard box, and carried him out to the curb amongst the mountain of New York City refuse. In the vast, uncaring machinery of the city's sanitation system, Etan Patz had simply been moved from one void to another. As Hernandez spoke, the map of the investigation shifted violently. The focus on remote burial sites and secret rooms vanished, replaced by the terrifying realization that the boy might have been mere feet away from the search parties, hidden in a trash heap while the world screamed his name. However, as the confession transitioned from the interrogation room to the legal arena, the narrative began to fracture. Pedro Hernandez was not a standard witness to his own crimes. His defense team quickly presented a medical history that painted a picture of a deeply fractured psyche. Diagnosed with schizotypal personality disorder, Hernandez was prone to hallucinations and had a history of confusing his vivid religious delusions with reality. He had an IQ that bordered on intellectual disability, making him a prime candidate for a false confession under the pressure of intense questioning. The legal battle became a philosophical inquiry. Was this the long-awaited truth, or was it the desperate attempt of a broken man to find a place for his own internal shadows in a famous tragedy? For Stan and Julie Patz, this new chapter brought a different kind of agony. After decades of directing their grief and anger toward Jose Ramos, they were suddenly forced to pivot toward a man who claimed to have thrown their son away like common waste. The lack of physical evidence remained the great gaping wound of the case. There were no bloodstains in the bodega basement, no DNA on the decades-old trash routes, and no body to provide a final, silent testimony. They were left with nothing but the words of a man whose own mind was a hall of mirrors. The tension in the Patz household was palpable. They wanted justice, but more than that, they wanted the truth, and the two were starting to look like they might never occupy the same space. As the 2015 trial approached, the city of New York watched with a mixture of fascination and dread. The courtroom became a theater of memory. Prosecutors argued that Hernandez's details, the dollar bill, the blue bag, the specific location, were things only the killer could know. The defense countered that these details were public knowledge, ingrained in the city's collective memory through decades of news reports and missing posters. The trial wasn't just about a murder. It was a trial of the American legal system's ability to find certainty in the absence of form. The jury was asked to look into the eyes of Pedro Hernandez and decide if they saw a killer finally unmasked or a victim of his own mind being used to close a file that had stayed open for too long. The atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy with the ghosts of 1979. When Julie Patz took the stand, the room fell into a silence so profound it felt as though the city outside had stopped breathing. She recounted that final morning, her voice steady but laden with the weight of 13,000 days of waiting. She wasn't just testifying against a man. She was testifying to the endurance of a mother's love. Every person in that room, from the bailiffs to the B-side HM1, felt the pull of her sorrow. It was no longer a matter of law. It was a matter of the human heart's refusal to let a child disappear without a trace. Yet, as the evidence was parsed and the psychological experts clashed, it became clear that the path to a verdict would be anything but a straight line. By the time the jury retreated to deliberate, the case of Atan Patz had once again evolved. It was no longer just a story of a missing boy or a cultural shift in parenting. It had become a meditation on the fragility of justice. If Hernandez was convicted, a 36-year-old mystery would be solved, but the questions about his mental state would linger. If he was acquitted, the Patz family would be cast back into the abyss of the unknown. The city waited. The flyers on the walls of the first precinct seemed to watch, and the basement on Prince Street remained a silent witness to a truth that refused to be fully told. The first trial ended not with a bang, but with a whimper of a hung jury, leaving the cycle of pain to begin all over again. The transition from a confession in a sterile interrogation room to a conviction in a court of law is rarely a straight line, but in the case of Atan Patz, it was a labyrinthine journey that pushed the American legal system to its absolute limits. By the time the first trial commenced in 2015, the world had changed, but the wound in the heart of Manhattan remained raw. The courtroom became a theater of ghosts, where the memories of 1979 were dissected with surgical precision. Prosecutors framed Pedro Hernandez not as a victim of his own mind, but as a man who had successfully evaded justice for 33 years, a predator who had blended into the mundane fabric of a New Jersey suburb while carrying the weight of a small boy's life in his conscience. They argued that his confession contained details that only the killer could know: the specific placement of the trash, the dollar bill, the blue bag details that formed the tether across decades, anchoring him to that basement on Prince Street. However, the defense mounted a formidable counter-narrative centered on the profound fragility of Hernandez's psyche. They brought in experts to testify about his history of hallucinations and his schizotypal personality disorder, suggesting that his confession was nothing more than a manifestation of a broken mind seeking a narrative for its own internal chaos. They pointed to the total absence of physical evidence: no DNA, no fibers, no remains, as proof that the state was attempting to convict a man based on shadows and whispers. This fundamental clash led to a deadlocked jury in the first trial, a hung jury that felt like another cruel delay in a 40-year search for an ending. For Stan and Julie Patz, the sight of a mistrial was a familiar agony, yet they remained steadfast, their presence in the front row a silent, unwavering demand for a resolution that refused to arrive. The second trial in 2017 took on a different, more somber energy. The prosecution refined its approach, focusing more of a child to those he loves unless the guilt is an unbearable reality. When the verdict was finally read guilty on counts of second-degree murder and first-degree kidnapping, the collective breath of New York City seemed to release in a long, shuddering exhale. For a brief moment, it appeared the story of Atan Patz had reached its final period. Hernandez was sentenced to 25 years to life, and the Patz family, graying and weary, finally spoke of a sense of closure. They had fought longer than most people live to hear that single word, guilty. But the machinery of justice is never truly still, especially in cases where the evidence is as ephemeral as a memory. The conviction was immediately challenged, spiraling into a series of appeals that would last nearly a decade. The core of the legal debate shifted from the facts of the crime to the technicalities of the trial, specifically how the judge had instructed the jury to weigh the psychiatric evidence and the reliability of a confession from a defendant with significant mental impairments. As the years passed, the case of Atan Patz became a landmark study in the intersection of mental health and criminal responsibility. The legal community watched with bated breath as the case climbed the rungs of the appellate ladder, a slow-motion collision between the need for finality and the requirement for a perfect trial. Then came the seismic shock of late 2025. A federal appeals court, in a decision that sent tremors through the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, vacated Pedro Hernandez's conviction. The court did not declare him innocent. Rather, it ruled that the trial judge had committed a reversible error in how the jury was guided to handle the complex psychiatric testimony. In an instant, the guilty verdict that had stood for 8 years was wiped away, and Hernandez returned to the status of a defendant presumed innocent. The news hit the Patz family like a physical blow. To have the truth legally established and then unraveled so many years later was a cruelty that defied description. Once again, the man who claimed to have killed their son stood on the threshold of freedom, and the legal file on Atan Patz, which many hoped was closed forever, was thrust wide open. The fallout was immediate and polarized. Public opinion, which had largely settled on Hernandez's guilt, was suddenly fractured by the cold reality of the law. Some saw the reversal as a failure of the system to protect victims, while others saw it as a necessary safeguard against the potential of a false confession. The Manhattan District Attorney, facing a crisis of public trust and a deadline that felt like a countdown to catastrophe, made a historic decision in November 2025. They would not only petition the U.S. Supreme Court to reinstate the conviction, but they would simultaneously begin the Herculean task of preparing for a third trial. The stakes could not be higher. A federal judge had ruled that if a retrial did not commence by June 2026, Hernandez would have to be released. As the legal teams began the grim work of re-interviewing aging witnesses and reviewing evidence that was now nearly half a century old, a new tension gripped the city. The prospect of a third trial in 2026 meant that the trauma of 1979 would be relitigated in a world that had almost forgotten what it was like to not be constantly connected. Investigators began to look deeper into the missing years of the investigation, searching for anything, a lost note, a forgotten testimony that could bolster the confession. They revisited the old files on Jose Ramos, the man who had been the primary suspect for 20 years, to ensure that no stone had been left unturned that could create reasonable doubt in a new jury's mind. The case had become a gargantuan puzzle where the pieces were made of smoke, and the board was a city that had moved on without ever truly healing. In the midst of this legal storm, the human element remained the most poignant. Stan and Julie Patz, now in their 80s, faced the reality of having to testify one more time. Their courage in the face of this endless cycle of hope and disappointment became a symbol of parental resilience that transcended the case itself. They were no longer just parents looking for a son. They were the guardians of a legacy of vigilance. The neighborhood of Soho, which had transformed from a gritty industrial loft district into a glittering hub of luxury, still carried the phantom presence of the boy on the milk carton. Every time the case returned to the headlines, the current residents were reminded that their expensive floors sat atop a history of unsolved sorrow. The legal strategy for the upcoming 2026 trial is expected to be a masterclass in modern forensics and behavioral psychology. Prosecutors are reportedly looking to utilize new advancements in linguistic analysis to prove that the details in Hernandez's confession were too specific to be anything other than a first-hand account. Conversely, the defense is doubling down on the narrative of a coerced confession from a vulnerable man, pointing to the lack of any physical smoking gun after decades of searching. The case has become a referendum on the nature of truth itself. Can a man be convicted for a crime that has no physical proof, no body, and no witnesses, solely on the strength of his own troubled words? As the calendar turns toward 2026, the silence that followed the 2025 reversal is being replaced by the frantic preparations of a justice system determined not to let Ethan Pats disappear a second time. The legal battle is no longer just about Pedro Hernandez. It is about whether the law can provide an answer to a question that has haunted America for 47 years. The world is watching, not just for a verdict, but to see if the memory of a 6-year-old boy can finally find a place to rest, or if he will remain a permanent, wandering ghost in the halls of the New York Supreme Court. The countdown to June 2026 has begun, and with it, the final, desperate attempt to turn the page on a story that has no happy ending, only the hope for a truthful one. The legal reversal of late 2025 sent a shockwave through the city of New York, a place that had finally begun to believe that the ghost of Ethan Pats had been laid to rest. When the federal appeals court vacated Pedro Hernandez's conviction, it didn't just reopen a legal case. It reopened a wound in the American consciousness that had been festering since 1979. The decision was rooted in the clinical, often cold mechanics of judicial procedure, specifically the judge's instructions regarding the reliability of a confession from a mentally ill defendant. But for the people walking the streets of Soho, and most acutely for the Pats family, it felt like a betrayal of the truth. As 2026 approaches, the case stands at a precipice, caught between the pursuit of absolute legal certainty and the desperate need for human closure. The current state of the investigation is a testament to the enduring mystery of the boy who vanished. Despite the conviction in 2017, the physical reality of Ethan's disappearance remains as opaque as it was on that Friday morning in May. No body has ever been recovered. No clothing, no blue cloth bag, no school books have ever surfaced from the vast shifting landscape of New York's history. This absence of material evidence is the silent protagonist of the case, the void that allows for endless theories and legal maneuvers. The prosecution's reliance on Hernandez's confession is a gamble on the weight of a man's conscience versus the frailty of his mind. In the absence of a grave, the courtroom becomes the only place where a tan can exist. As the Manhattan District Attorney's Office prepares for the potential 2026 retrial, they are navigating a different world than the one in which Ethan lived. The Soho of 1979, a gritty industrial frontier for artists, has been replaced by a playground for the global elite. The bodega where Hernandez worked is gone, replaced by high-end retail that bears no mark of the basement horrors described in the confession. Yet, the case refuses to be gentrified. It remains a raw, visceral reminder of a time when the city was a more dangerous, unpredictable place. The detectives now assigned to the case are looking at evidence through the lens of modern behavioral science, trying to determine if Hernandez's descriptions of the struggle and the box match the logistical realities of 1979 sanitation routes. They are searching for a needle of truth in a haystack of decades-old memories. For Stan and Julie Patz, the endurance required is almost superhuman. They have spent nearly 50 years in a state of arrested development, their lives forever tethered to the moment Julie watched her son walk toward the corner of Prince Street. They have seen suspects come and go, from the predatory Jose Ramos to the soft-spoken Pedro Hernandez. They have won civil suits and watched criminal convictions crumble. Their loft remains a lighthouse, a place where the light is always on, even if the shore it illuminates has changed beyond recognition. To witness their resilience is to witness the ultimate form of parental devotion, a refusal to let the world forget a boy whose only crime was wanting to grow up. Their presence in the courtroom is a moral weight that no legal technicality can easily dismiss. The legacy of Etan Patz is etched into the very fabric of American life. Every time a parent checks a child's location on a smartphone, every time an Amber Alert blares across a television screen, and every time a school bus driver double-checks their roster, the spirit of Etan is there. He was the catalyst for a fundamental shift in the way society views the safety of its children. The milk carton era may have ended, replaced by digital databases and satellite tracking, but the underlying anxiety remains. Etan taught America that even the most familiar streets can hold secrets, and that the distance between safety and catastrophe can be measured in a few short blocks. He became the face of the missing, a symbol that transformed private grief into public policy. Yet, as we look toward the potential 2026 trial, the case remains a mosaic of unanswered questions. What if Hernandez's confession was indeed the hallucination of a man obsessed with religious penance? What if Jose Ramos, now an old man in prison, holds the real secret to Etan's whereabouts? The possibility of a third trial brings with it the terrifying prospect of another hung jury or an acquittal, which would leave Hernandez a free man and the Patz family without even a legal finality. The American justice system is designed to protect the innocent, even at the cost of failing to punish the guilty, and the Etan Patz case is the ultimate test of that principle. It asks, how much uncertainty can we live with? The impact on the community of Soho and the wider legal landscape cannot be overstated. The case has become a cautionary tale for law enforcement about the dangers of tunnel vision and the importance of forensic integrity. It has also highlighted the evolution of how we treat mental illness within the criminal justice system. Hernandez is not a typical villain. He is a man whose own mind is a labyrinth, and the struggle to determine his guilt is, in many ways, a struggle to define the limits of human responsibility. If he is tried again, it will be a battle of experts, a clash of psychologists and historians. As the sun sets over the Hudson and the lights of Manhattan begin to flicker on, the silence of the Patz case remains the most powerful thing about it. It is a silence that demands an answer, a silence that has persisted through 10 presidents and countless changes in the city's skyline. Etan Patz should have been a man in his 50s today, perhaps an artist like his father, perhaps a father himself. Instead, he remained 6 years old, forever frozen in a photograph, walking toward a corner he would never turn. The story of Etan is a tragedy of the almost. He was almost at the bus, he was almost safe, the truth was almost found. In the final analysis, the case of Etan Patz is not just about a crime. It is about the enduring power of memory and the refusal to accept the unacceptable. Whether the 2026 trial brings a final conviction or a final release, the truth of Etan will never be fully contained within a courtroom. He lives in the laws that protect children today, in the vigilance of every parent, and in the heart of a city that never stops looking for its lost children. The cobblestones of Soho may have been paved over, but the echoes of a 6-year-old's footsteps still ring through the halls of justice, a reminder that some secrets are too heavy to stay buried forever, and some lives are too precious to be forgotten. The world waits for the next chapter, for the moment when the scales of justice finally balance, or when the silence of the earth is finally broken. Until then, we carry the image of the boy in the blue parka, a small figure walking into the morning light, a symbol of the innocence we all lost on a Friday in May 1979. The search continues, not just for a boy, but for the soul of a justice system that must decide what it owes to the missing, the dead, and the families who refuse to say goodbye.